So you might have noticed that Wim Hof has a curious set of scars on his abdomen. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what those scars, how he got those scars, and what those scars mean for the Wim Hof method in general. Now, just for background, I'm Scott Carney, I'm an investigative journalist, and I have known Wim since 2010, when I was the first sort of American investigative real journalist to go out and meet him and try his method. And I will say that it changed my life. Like, I did the method. I wrote this book, What Doesn't Kill Us, about him because I'd been doing his breath work, doing his ice immersions for a long time. And, I'm going to say some things in this video that may not make him sound all that great, but I want to preface it with it has been life-changing. It has been very, very good for me. And I really stand by the science of the Wim Hof method. I stand by the cold exposure, and there's tons and millions of videos out there that explain the benefits of the Wim Hof method. But I get a lot of questions about his scars, and I think they show a lesson that we have sort of forgotten about Wim Hof as he has grown to this international guy of, superstardom, with Joe Rogan endorsing it, and he's on the Goop Lab. He has this new BBC special that's coming out on the BBC. I mean, he has really become this sort of international man of mystery. And I have to say that I'm, at this point, a little embarrassed. A regret maybe just tinily, like a little bit, not including this story in What Doesn't Kill Us, because I think it's very instructive. Now, we want to go back in time to really sort of where Wim Hof began as a person. Now, you know him as the Iceman now, but he was not always that. Wim was a post deliverer for a while. He was a climbing instructor in Spain, and he lived in a squat. He lived in actually the United States Embassy building in Amsterdam that was abandoned and squatted by all these homeless people. He was one of the people to live in that building. He went to India. He learned some breath work there that became probably the basis of the Wim Hof method. And in that time, Wim had a number of children. There's Einam, there's Michael, there's Laura. There are, many kids by Wim from a few different ladies. And Wim, how to characterize him, he was not maybe the best dad in the world. There was this time period where the kids were being raised in Amsterdam. And this is all based on my memories of interviews with both Wim Hof and his son Einam. And I might get a couple details wrong, but I'm pretty sure we're more or less on track. So Wim was living out of Amsterdam, and he had more or less left his kids to be raised by Einam in Amsterdam. And he was going off, still sort of like quasi-known as this weird guy who was jumping into ice water. But his kids were, for all intents and purposes, sort of abandoned by Wim, and he hadn't seen his kids, and they were, Einam, I believe, was around like 18 or 19 in this time period, and there was 4 people living in this apartment in Amsterdam alone. And so as Wim sort of goes around the country, sort of living sort of on the edge of not doing, super well financially, not doing sort of, trying to get his method sort of acknowledged by folks. His kids were basically not in the picture. Now, 10 years on, Wim is starting to get a little bit of traction. He's done some documentaries showing that he can swim underneath ice water, which we're going to talk about in a second, and wanted to bring his family back together. I mean, he hadn't seen some of these kids in a long time. One of them, Michael, who's, I guess, the third or fourth in line, his fourth kid. He hadn't seen him in a while, and Wim was getting a little bit of respectability. And he'd sent sort of Michael this first note saying, Michael, I want to meet you again, and it will be, good to reconnect. And as I understand it, he hadn't seen him for 10 years. So Wim sets up a time and place to meet him at a park in Amsterdam. And just to paint you a picture of what this park looks like, there's this big sort of lake in the middle with an artificial fountain that spurts up water into the air, and then sort of it falls back down. Now, Wim arrives early at this place, and he knows Michael's going to be coming there, and my guess is that he's a little nervous, right? He hasn't seen him for a while. How will his son, who's estranged from him, react? And he, I guess because he's crazy Wim, he decides to go swimming in the fountain of this park. And he swims out into the middle of it. And again, this is just because he's a crazy Wim guy. He goes to the center of the fountain. Again, it's spurting up. And he sits on it and plans to give himself an enema with the spurting fountain. And he says that he had done this before. He had enemas are not very popular in my country. There might be a little bit more popular in the Netherlands, but it's still a pretty weird and albeit dangerous thing to do. And he sits on this spurting fountain, and it cuts through his intestines, like a water knife. It just sort of spurts through and eviscerates his digestive system. And when I was asking him about this, he said that they must have changed the nozzle on the fountain because the fountain was more powerful than he had done before. So he'd done this before? It's crazy. But so he swims back to shore, and as he gets there, Michael shows up, and Wim Hof is now, dying. Dying because all of his intestines have been ripped, and the first thing he says to Michael is, "Bring me to a hospital." And I think this is an important psychological point to make, because I think my interpretation of this is that he was feeling bad about not seeing his children for 10 years. And maybe this was some way to externalize his feelings of regret from that. And that's why he actually did this. This is my interpretation. But anyway, he sees Michael, and Michael, I don't know what Michael's thinking, but he does take him to the hospital. And Wim goes there. And some of this is recounted in this book, which is Becoming the Iceman by Justin Rosales, where he does mention some of the story in there. And the reason why it comes up in that story is because Wim is sitting in the emergency room, and the way he talks about it is that he has a very good pain tolerance, and so he doesn't display any of the symptoms of a person who's dying because all their intestines were ripped apart. And he said, and they don't even address him until he basically passes out. They realize what a life-threatening emergency is. They put him into the operating, and they, whatever the doctors do, they suture him up, and he is then alive. And the way he writes about it is he says that after this surgery, he didn't take any antibiotics, and he just breathed his way into sort of healing. I don't necessarily believe that part of the story. But this is what he says. This is his account. Now, I want to point out that giving yourself an almost fatal enema is a real lack of judgment, right? In sort of safety protocols, and it's not a really good idea to do that. And whether or not he's doing this because of the grief of his son, or just because it was a crazy happenstance that happened on that particular day, it's important to realize that Wim Hof has this great method of cold exposure and breath work that has revolutionized my life, has changed the lives of millions of people around the world, and you have to give him credit to that. But he is still this crazy guy who makes some decisions that are not necessarily the best decisions out there. And I have been worried for years that Wim Hof is being put on a pedestal where people look at him like this great, almost infallible person who has some access to secret knowledge that is changing the world in some beneficial way to the better, and that we sort of need to do communion with Wim to do this. And I think that is a bit of a problem, because Wim Hof, while he is, you could say he's a prophet of this whole ice water stuff that's going around right now, he's also a madman. And he has done things like this repeatedly throughout his career, that should give us some pause. And, let me take one more example. Another thing that he's known for is swimming underneath great stretches of ice water. He has a Guinness Book of World Record for the longest underwater, no breathing apparatus method for swimming under ice. Now, it was a pretty cool feat, but if you actually look at what happened, he actually did 2 attempts. So on the first attempt, he swam under the ice. They poked these holes in the ice. He swam under it, and his eyes froze so that his corneas, he couldn't see, and he had to be rescued by a rescue diver or he would have drowned. The next day he does it. I think he's probably wearing goggles, and he actually survives this. But because of this conflation between Wim Hof's underwater abilities, several people over the course of the last, 10 years since he got famous, have combined his breath work with essentially free diving. And I'm aware of news reports of about 5 people dying because they have drowned doing the method, either under the ice or just swimming in pools and doing the method. And the thing is, when you do this rapid breath work, it becomes easier to pass out, even though you can hold your breath for a longer period of time. You don't have the signals in your body that stop that sort of danger moment coming to your brain, and then you pass out and you die because you're underwater. You take this involuntary breath. And even though Wim Hof's official websites say, don't try this with water, certainly the marketing around Wim Hof indicates that you can do both, that you can go underwater and you can do this. Wim Hof is known for swimming underwater, and maybe you could do this too. I think there's sort of an issue with how the image is presented and the way the method is perhaps taught. So that's one other problem. But yet another thing that has happened is when I was climbing up Mount Kilimanjaro with Wim. So the end of What Doesn't Kill Us, again, this book that I wrote, which was a New York Times bestseller, did very well. I'm probably one of the biggest Wim Hof proponents in the world. When we hiked up Mount Kilimanjaro, we were doing it very fast, and you might argue even too fast, because when we got to the last leg, there was this mutiny because Wim Hof wanted to break a record, and everyone else was like, no, we want to eat lunch because there are some dangers of doing a big physical exertion without energy. And literally of our group of about 30 people, only me, because I had to write a book, Wim and one other guy went up. All of our guides actually did this mutiny around him. And this, it sort of like went contrary to what Wim said, because at the very beginning of the journey, he was like, to this trip, we will all do it together. There is no ego, there is only we go. That's a rough quote of what he had said at the very beginning of this. But then as soon as he said that quote, he just ran up the mountain, and everyone was like, wait, where'd Wim go? Now, I want to raise these 3 issues, right? The injury to his abdomen, the ice water blindness, and this other, and us going up Mount Kilimanjaro together, to note that repeatedly Wim Hof's judgment is not necessarily erring on the side of safety in all cases. And I think, before I met Wim Hof, there was this, what I had written was this other book called The Enlightenment Trap, which is about the culty things that happen with very charismatic leaders, where you sort of get enraptured with this idea of superpowers, and makes people sort of insane. Like, people really sort of follow these culty figures and do things that are really against their interests. Now, I think that if I had written What Doesn't Kill Us today, I would have been more wary than I was when I first started following the Wim Hof method. Now, he is almost, one of the problems with cult leaders is that they become infallible. Like, they rise to this point where they are looked at and adored by all of their followers, and they say, wow, you really have something special. And that is actually a very isolating place to be, because once you are infallible, once you are sort of like the perfect superstar, people sort of defer to your judgment. But if your judgment is not sound to begin with, that is a problem. And this is why I think that it's really important to acknowledge that Wim is awesome in so many ways, but one of the reasons why he's awesome is because they also have these failures that he has, these character flaws that we have to acknowledge. Like, one of the reasons why I love Wim is because when I'm hanging out with him, I'm like, oh my God, Wim, you are so like out there and weird, and like I would never want to be you, but thank you so much for like opening this door. And I feel like that message is not out there right now. Instead, what we see is, Wim doing these superhuman feats over and over, and the camera sort of pans away when he gets crazy, when he does something sort of really weird. And I think that really does a disservice to Wim, first of all, but also to the millions of people following him who really think that secret is somehow essential to who he is. And what I want to say is that Wim doesn't have superpowers. We all have those powers. These are human things. These are not sort of like extra human things beaming down prana from the universe that gives him these powers. Then he's giving it to you because you are his disciple and he is the guru. That is not what is happening. And sometimes he even says that. One of his famous quotes is, "I am not your fucking guru." But we need to inhabit that, because now that he has become so famous, and he's hanging out with some very important celebrities who have enormous social media followings, it's easy to get confused about what this method is really about. And what it is about, in my opinion, is the science that is behind it, and not necessarily looking great in ice water. So anyway, that's my rant for right now. Feel free to leave a comment. Some of you may not agree with me. Some of you may say, well, you got famous off Wim's image, which is a pretty common comment. I have certainly benefited from the Wim Hof method. I was very early in this, and I don't know if that's entirely fair that to think that I am stealing his image. What I'm doing is just trying to report, as I have reported on many of my books, and trying to be as an objective observer, watching this method, watching it grow, supporting the good stuff, and telling the truth at every stage I can. So anyway, thank you so much for watching. I may do more of these videos if you guys like them, and rate, comment, all that internet stuff. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Bye.